Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 556, Enter the Abbey. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I am well. I am so grateful to everyone who was on the Thursday night Zoom call this week because, holy cow, did I get a treasure trove of information for everybody else. Because my life is boring, I am collecting information from everywhere and all of the smart people. And I have some good stuff for you. And I'm going to kick it off with a voicemail from Christine, who you will remember from Tin of Tans back when I still lived in Arizona. So first, we hear from Christine.
Hi, Heather. This is Tin of Tans, Christine. I am very thankful for the fun chapters you've been reading. May the Care is lovely. Got me through a very bad migraine headache this week. I heard that someone was recommending Mary Robinette Kowal's books, and they are lovely. I thought you would all like to know that she's also a regular host of the Writing Excuses podcast, where she and three other regular writers plus some guests talk about the business and craft of writing. And anyone who likes to listen to ideas about how things are made, whether or not they make that thing, it can be interesting. So I like listening to books. It's fun for me to listen to how people who write them do it. It's sort of like if you like to knit or crochet, it can be fun to read about how they were designed, although, that can also get old. I have to write those sometimes and they get old to write. One more thing, Mary Robinette Kowal crochets, and the Regency dress that's on the cover of one of her, I can't remember the name of that series. Anyway, she made that by hand, and she used a silk sari for the base. So sometimes she'll write in her endnotes about the history of textiles. So I think a lot of people who enjoy your podcast would enjoy reading Mary Robinette Kowal's works and looking for in other spaces on the web too. And probably a lot of you would enjoy the Writing Excuses podcast.
All right, so the comment on Mary Robinette Kowal's got repeated again. Christine, you are backed up by many people. I've heard from quite a few, including Jennifer at our Thursday night Zoom, which again, you are all welcome to join. The easiest way to find the link right now is on the Facebook group, and I will put it into the show notes as well. The show notes are easiest to find on the app or at craftlit.libsyn.com until we get the website back up and running, which it will. It's just, there are things that have been going on the interwebs in the way of trying to protect people that are interfering with the way things have been done in the past. It was much easier to do a whole podcasty thing back in, say, 2006. It is a lot more complicated now, and weird stuff keeps happening. So I appreciate your patience. The app should be working again. I did have to restart my phone because it went through a massive update. I am not unhappy about that. The app is better now, so that's good. And last night, Amy alerted me to the fact that there were questions hanging out there in Facebook land in particular, asking what is the best way to support Craftlit, which I really appreciate. I think that is lovely, especially because I have a feeling I'm going to be unemployed again shortly. The best way to support Craftlit is whatever's easiest for you. The amount of money that is taken out in fees and things like that is just about equivalent, whether you are supporting the show through the app or whether you are supporting the show through Patreon. Either way, it winds up being about the same amount of loss. So it comes out to what's the easiest access point for you. Go with that. That is awesome sauce. And thank you. So we have on the show notes, I put the links in again for Mary Robinette Cole in case you didn't find them before. A link to the Writing Excuses podcast. A link to, Jennifer also shared, I think it was Jennifer, a memory called Empire, which is a science fiction murder mystery. And then Leanne shared that if you, that is you yourself, want to vote for the Hugo Awards, this is something that normal mortals can do. If you go to the Hugo Awards website, their governing body, and you purchase for like $45-$50, something like that, a supporting membership, they will send you digitally all of the things that are being voted on. And then you can read all of the things that are being voted on for that 40 or 50, 45 or $50. And then you vote. How cool is that? It's like normal people get to participate in stuff. I love it. So that's pretty nifty. Then we wandered away from books for a little while and went into music. So I have a link out to Marion Call's song, I'll Still Be a Geek After Nobody Thinks It's Chic, which is also known as the Nerd Anthem. We have a YouTube link to that and a YouTube link to the Double Clicks Oh Mr. Darcy, which just made me happy. And then we have an update on things to watch. One, the Mitchells versus the Machines. Holy cow. If you haven't seen this yet, it's on Netflix. I would recommend not drinking a lot of liquid before seeing it. I did not think it was going to be that funny or make me laugh that hard, but Maya Rudolph as the mom, Maya Rudolph. I'm saying Maya because I'm so used to saying Maya DeGuerre. Ha! Thanks, Maya. Maya Rudolph is spectacular as the mother. And as soon as she kicks into gear during the climax, both of my boys turned and looked at me and said, "Oh my gosh, you would totally do that, wouldn't you?" And of course the answer is yes. Yes, of course I would. The other thing about the Mitchells versus the Machines that you need to know is that there's a scene early on where the young brother named Aaron does some things as a young child that everyone in our family looked at our Aaron and said, "Oh my God, they were watching you." You need to know that he was one of the people who said that as well to himself. It is spectacular and adorable. And anyone who's had a boy in their family who has liked dinosaurs, you will find it very, very sweet. So Mitchells versus the Machines is the first one up on Netflix. Second on Netflix, Stowaway, starring Toni Collette and Anna Kendrick. Then over on Amazon Prime, we have a recommendation for The Wilds. And I think, Amy, you said somebody you know got cast in the second season of that or something? That was very cool. And then from Kelly, the Secretly Incredibly Fascinating podcast, which sounds to be exactly right up my alley as well. Kelly knows me well. Thank you. All right, so that is everything I collected last night before I had to get off because I was exhausted. I had to get up earlier to record today, and I didn't want to not get you the 2 chapters that we have for today. That would be chapters 20 and 21. I'm excited because we're moving. We are in motion today and heading to the Abbey. So not only do you get to see the outside of the Abbey in today's chapters, but you will get to go inside as well. But we do have some things to understand before we dive into the chapters. And some of these are a little bit different from usual because it's kind of subtextual to us information. And I say subtextual to us because anybody who'd been reading it back in the day would have understood without even blinking what was being said. We simply don't travel like this anymore in most places. And as a consequence, there's information that's just not being transmitted unless we have annotations. So here I'm going to go in order as we find these things coming to us in our chapters today. So the first bit is actually physical comedy, and it's beautifully written because Jane Austen actually writes it quite quickly as well. So it's compressed language, and you kind of can't help but read it rather quickly, or your eyes skim over it rather quickly. We know that the General Tilney, likes to be, not surprisingly, a little punctual, and he's nuts about being on time. And so as a consequence, everything must be loaded into the carriages on time. And that means things are a bit of a hustle and a bustle because, of course, things probably aren't packed until right before on time. So Austen has a scene where things are being, quote unquote, handed down, which is the trunks are being carried downstairs by servants, and then they're being gotten into the carriages as quickly as possible. So this creates a bit of slapstick because instead of the general's coat being out for him to wear in the carriage he's going to be riding in with Henry, his coat is laid out on the seat in the chaise that Eleanor and Catherine and Eleanor's lady's maid are all going to be riding in. So it's like putting a stadium blanket down in the chaise, and they're all supposed to now sit on it. Plus, there's a thing about a chaise, there's a fixed seat for three in the chaise, and then there's another seat, usually, that can be taken out. In this case, the phrase is, the middle seat of the chaise was not drawn out, though there were three people to get into it. So they only need seats for three people. Well, the bench seat, the main seat in the back, is plenty wide enough for three young ladies to sit on. They don't need that middle seat. It should have been taken out, removed. But instead it was left there. And so these three girls have to cram in to their seats with all of their parcels and packages. And that creates more slapstick, including Catherine almost losing her new writing desk. And if you haven't seen writing desks of the style that she's talking about, I will link out to one. It's a portable wooden box with a slanted top that had, the slanted top was actually a lid. And if you flip the lid open, there's space for paper, quills, ink, all of that kind of stuff. And then when you close the lid, because it's on a slant, you can use it as a writing surface. And you can put the ink bottle and the quill on top. Where the hinged bit is, there's usually a little platform shelf flat area that is not sloped, so the ink won't slide off of it. It would be horizontal to the ground. So that's the writing desk that Catherine almost loses in the melee of getting into the carriages in the first place. There is the mention of a 2 hours bait at Petty France. Petty France is a town north of Bath. It's about halfway to their destination. And a bait, it's a rest stop. It's an opportunity for them to feed the horses and pause. Now, if they were traveling by post-chaise, where you are paying a company to take you from point to point to point, and at each point you would switch out horses and get a new team of horses and then keep going, you would not have a 2-hour pause. You would pause long enough to switch out the team of horses, perhaps get some sustenance to travel with at a local inn, and then move along. General Tilney owns all of his horses, and he's giving them a 2-hour rest halfway through the journey. This indicates, number one, that he's got some serious cash. Number two, that he cares about the horses. Or it could be, number three, he is kind of a penny pincher and just doesn't want the horses to wear out because they're an expense to replace. A little hard to tell at this point when it comes to General Tilney. Either way, it is an extended stop, the 2-hour bait. And then there's one last bit about the chaise. So the carriage has room for three in back. It has an extra seat that you can insert to turn that into 6. But part of the reason why the chaise is such an odd-ish kind of transport is because there's no seat for a coachman, which means that you need postilions. You need guys who ride horseback on the horses who are drawing this particular carriage. And if they are particularly good postilions, they would be posting as they ride. That means they would be doing that remarkably timing-intensive move on horseback where you actually stand up in the stirrups at the same rhythm that the horse is going at, so you are more comfortable and you are doing a better job of moving with the horse and not wearing them out by fighting their motion quite as much as you could otherwise. But it's really quite something to see when you have a team of horses and guys who are on those horses doing this particular maneuver. It also means that these guys must have the most amazing quads ever, which is not a bad thing either. Outriders would be extra riders. These would be other servants and people who are also traveling back to the main home with General Tilney. They are part of the entourage, but they would be riding not right in front of or right in back of, but kind of out and not super close to the carriages that are carrying the family. One of the annotations that I am not going to read to you because it's complicated, I'm going to sum up for you, and it is this. As we have seen with Austen all the way through this book, she has been really accurate when she talks about how long it takes to get places and how far things are away from everywhere else and all of that information. She's really gone to town with the accuracy of distance and how quickly or not animals, like horses, can travel those distances. She is doing the same here with General Tilney's carriages, and that's awesome. It gets complicated, but the upshot, what you need to know is General Tilney is actually doing an interesting thing here. He is, by having more horses pulling the carriages than are strictly necessary, he is making sure that none of the horses are pulling the full weight. Having more than one horse pull at a time means that neither horse has to work as much as they would if it was just them. That makes a certain amount of sense. However, he's even gone above and beyond that, and because he keeps a steady pace and has more than the required number of horses, he is actually able to make better time and doesn't have to stop as often. So instead of doing the penny wise but a pound foolish, he's actually gone ahead and said, okay, it may be more money to maintain these horses, the number of horses, but I wear them out more slowly. They're not going to, as many horses did at the time, die a young death. They are going to be well maintained, well fed, well cared for. They are not going to be overworked. And as a consequence, and this is a little Elizabeth Gaskell-like with her whole North and South, how to run a factory thing. As a consequence of not having them overworked, overtaxed, and miserable, they are going to work better and ultimately go faster. We will be able to maintain a better pace. We won't have to stop as much. So even though they take this big 2-hour break midway through their journey, they're only taking 1 instead of 4. So General Tilney's a smart guy. He also actually does appear to care. It's just in weird ways that we can see how he's caring, which is a little piece of information to file away for the future. Now, there's one thing I'm going to give you a very short bit of information on right now, and then I want to fill you in on some funny stuff about it after. You're going to hear something about a Rumford that a formerly large, wide, I'm thinking, in my own mind, I am thinking not so much Gothic, but I am thinking of Citizen Kane and the big, big room that has the big, big fireplace that you could roast several humans in on spits. I am thinking of a fireplace like that having been reduced in width and size to what is called a Rumford. Rumford was an American who moved to Britain after the Revolution. So he was a loyalist. He moved back to Britain. He became Count Rumford. He was an interesting guy. Anyway, he did to fireplaces what Benjamin Franklin did to stoves. So if you've ever seen a Franklin stove, this was a cast iron stove that could be put into a fireplace. And of course, the radiating heat coming off of the sides and front of a cast iron stove, not to mention the cooking space that it put on top of that stove, would have done a much better job of heating a room than a mere fireplace could have done. We have talked in the past about fireplace screens and how difficult it was to find a place in a room where one could be warmed appropriately from a fireplace. A cast iron stove would have done much more good. Rumford came along and found a way to not have to use cast iron in order to accomplish that, but in fact could do much the same thing with slabs of marble, which hadn't really been used much in Britain up until this point. And so the beginning of the 1800s, end of the 1700s, beginning of the 1800s, a bunch of things were changing. Duh, Heather. In Britain at the time, one of those was the importing of Italian marble. So a Rumford fireplace meant that that big, Gothic, expansive, human roasting sized fireplace would have been reduced to an aperture of about a foot, maybe a foot and a half wide. It also meant that the heat would have been better aimed, more concentrated, and it would have made the room far less drafty. It also would have made it far less Gothic sexy, is the problem. But I'll tell you more about the humorous side of the Rumford. It's such a perfect name for it, too. Thank God that was his last name. I'll tell you more on the flip side. There's some fun stuff. Casement windows. This is where the window glass, usually leaded, usually in diamond-shaped panes with diagonal leading, were placed into metal cases. Those cases then had latches, metal latches, that attached. On one side they were hinged, on the other side you had these latches. The latches you could move up or down, and by moving the handle up or down, you would be able to push the casement window out or in, depending on the way the hinges worked. But either way, the windows weren't sliding the way that sash windows that we are still using today do. These were the kind of windows that would swing like a door, in or out. And of course, with frames like that, they would rattle when the wind blew. They would be very hard to seal, so you get very, very draftiness. The importance here of having lead, this flexible metal that you could use to hold the panes of glass in place, would have been important for several reasons. One, you don't want them coming loose, and having the kind of plasticity of lead there would help. Number two, the actual panes of glass themselves were inconsistently sized. That is also one of the reasons why, if you've ever had the good fortune to tour an older place that has old glass, old original glass in it, one of the ways you can tell it's old glass, usually, is because it has kind of a ripply effect to it. It's not perfectly flat. It's not perfectly smooth. It does warp your vision a little bit, which is fun, but would be truly annoying if you were, an artist trying to draw out of your window during inclement weather when you can't go outside. That could get a little on the side of things. But the other inconsistency that you often see in these old casement windows and old glass is color. Sometimes the color was not particularly clear, and that would affect the amount of light that could come in, which also helped make these old Gothic places seem quite gloomy. So keep that in mind when you start hearing about windows. When we get to chapter 21, or volume 2, chapter 6, if you are following along in a book that has the volumes set out for you, there is yet another colloquialism, just a phrasing of the time that we probably don't use anymore. Although if you do, I am fascinated. Please let me know at 206-350-1642. I would love to know if this is still language that you use. The language being, when Catherine gets in, she prepares to unpin the linen package. It may have been linen, it may have been another linen-esque kind of fabric. Either way, it would have been a relatively sturdy, relatively substantial piece of fabric that was pinned up and placed into the carriage with her, not into a packing case, not into her writing desk, not into a trunk that was strapped to the back of the carriages, but a package that was handed to her or carried by her that contained whatever she would need upon arrival. So whether it was another dress to wear or a hairbrush, a toothbrush, tooth powder, something like that, it would be those things that one might need right away, depending on what time you arrive at your destination. Basically a carry-on or an overnight bag, something that you would be able to carry by hand, but that you could pre-pack with, oh yeah, I'm going to need that when I get there, stuff. I believe we have come across the term Japan being used this way in a previous book, but I cannot for the life of me remember which book it was. Either way, we in the West had started to learn just a wee bit about Japan and that black lacquer, the beautiful black lacquer work that was famous for being something that was done in Japan. You are going to hear that lacquer work referred to as the cabinet was Japan, the same way you might say the cabinet was ebony or mahogany. So a Japan finish would be not a Japanese finish, and there's a reason why it's not Japanese. A Japan finish at this time would have been a black lacquer, usually, that thick lacquer that was inlaid with often gold or semi-precious stones, cut stones, things like that. This should probably be something that we have seen something like in our lifetime. Okay, here's where using the term Japan the way they do makes sense. By this point in time, the point in time that this book is being written and consumed for the first time, there were people in Britain, craftsmen in Britain, who were making this same kind of lacquered finish themselves. Instead of referring only to things that came from Asia as Japan finish, anything that had that kind of black lacquer and inlaid finish was a Japan finish. So it wasn't Japanese imported, it was that finish that we all know that came from Japan. Okay, and the very last, I promise you, the very last thing that you need to know that everybody would have known back when this book was written is something that I completely misunderstood my entire life. Here we go. Heather is ashamed. Snuffing a candle. I had always thought that snuffing a candle was a single action by which one would take either a candle snuffer, the little metal bell-shaped thing that you could place over an open flame on a candle, and by depriving the flame of oxygen, put it out, thus creating far less smoke or risk of burning wax being flung about by your breath than if you blew the candle out. So a candle snuffer seemed to me like a single action used in a specific way. Turns out that's not necessarily correct. There are evidently things called snuffing scissors. I knew that there were specialized scissors used for cutting and trimming wicks. I didn't understand the purpose behind the multiple steps involved with this. Here we go. Tallow candles. Tallow candles, which, and I'm going off the top of my head here, so I'm going to get part of this wrong. Please write in if you have made tallow candles and can share some information with the rest of us. Tallow candles, when they burned down, at least at this time, the wicks didn't evaporate into a puff of smoke as they burned. The wicks, as they burnt down, would leave kind of a curly bit that wasn't completely gone. As they burnt down, the longer that wick got that was not moving or evaporating, the longer that wick got, the dimmer the candle got, at which point one would want to take out one's snuffing scissors and trim the wick. That would brighten the candle right back up again, and you would have enough light to see by. This kind of obviously presents several risks. One of those risks would be if you cut the wick too short because your hands are shaking, you would put out the candle because you would wind up with not enough exposed wick to burn. Everything would be below wax level, and that's a very hard candle to relight, especially if you don't have any matches in the room because you brought the candle up with you that had been lit with a rush light from a fireplace. So, if you are in a situation like this, you have one other choice. If enough wick is exposed, just enough wick, it is possible that if you very carefully, very gently, blow oh so gently on the wick, you can reignite that light. And that's all I'm going to tell you. All right. I promise you that was it. That was it. Let's listen now to chapters 20 and 21, or volume 2, chapters 5 and 6 of Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, read for us by Maya Daguerre. Here we go.
Chapter 20. Mr. and Mrs. Allen were sorry to lose their young friend, whose humour and cheerfulness had made her a valuable companion, and in the promotion of whose enjoyment their own had greatly been increased. Her happiness going with Miss Tilney, however, prevented their wishing it otherwise, and as they were to remain only one more week in Bath themselves, her quitting them now would not be long felt. Mr. Allen attended her to Milsom Street, where she was to breakfast, and saw her seated with the kindest welcome among her new friends. But so great was her agitation in finding herself as one of the family, and so fearful was she of not doing exactly what was right, and of not being able to preserve their good opinion, that in the embarrassment of that first 5 minutes she could almost have wished to return with him to Pulteney Street. Miss Tilney's manners and Henry's smile soon did away some of her unpleasant feelings, but still she was far from being at ease, nor could the incessant attentions of the General himself entirely reassure her. Nay, perverse as it seemed, she doubted whether she might not have felt less had she been less attended to. His anxiety for her comfort, his continual solicitations that she would eat, and his often expressed fears of her seeing nothing to her taste, though never in her life before had she beheld such a variety on a breakfast table, made it impossible for her to forget for a moment that she was a visitor. She felt utterly unworthy of such respect, and knew not how to reply to it. Her tranquillity was not improved by the General's impatience for the appearance of his eldest son, nor by the displeasure he expressed at his laziness when Captain Tilney at last came down. She was quite pained by the severity of his father's reproach, which seemed disproportionate to the offence, and much was her concern increased when she found herself the principal cause of the lecture, and that his tardiness was chiefly resented from being disrespectful to her. This was placing her in a very uncomfortable situation, and she felt great compassion for Captain Tilney, without being able to hope for his goodwill. He listened to his father in silence, and attempted not any defence, which confirmed her in fearing that the inquietude of his mind, on Isabella's account, might, by keeping him long sleepless, have been the real cause of his rising late. It was the first time of her being decidedly in his company, and she had hoped to be now able to form her opinion of him, But she scarcely heard his voice while his father remained in the room, and even afterwards, so much were his spirits affected, she could distinguish nothing but these words in a whisper to Eleanor: "How glad I shall be when you are all off." The bustle of going was not pleasant. The clock struck 10 while the trunks were carried down, and the General had fixed to be out of Milsom Street by that hour. His greatcoat, instead of being brought for him to be put on directly, was spread out in the curricle in which he was to accompany his son. The middle seat of the chaise was not drawn out, though there were 3 people to go in it, and his daughter's maid had so crowded it with parcels that Miss Morland would not have room to sit. And so much was he influenced by this apprehension when he handed her in, that she had some difficulty in saving her own new writing desk from being thrown out into the street. At last, however, the door was closed upon the 3 females, and they set off at the sober pace in which the handsome, highly fed 4 horses of a gentleman usually performed a journey of 30 miles. Such was the distance of Northanger from Bath, to be now divided into 2 equal stages. Catherine's spirits revived as they drove from the door, for with Miss Tilney she felt no restraint, and with the interest of the road entirely new to her, of an abbey before and a curricle behind, she caught the last view of Bath without any regret, and met with every milestone before she expected it. The tediousness of a 2 hours' wait at Petty France, in which there was nothing to be done but to eat without being hungry, and loiter about without anything to see, next followed, and her admiration of the style in which they travelled, of the fashionable chaise and 4, postilions handsomely liveried, rising so regularly in their stirrups, and numerous outriders properly mounted, sunk a little under this consequent inconvenience. Had their party been perfectly agreeable, the delay would have been nothing. But General Tilney, though so charming a man, seemed always a check upon his children's spirits, and scarcely anything was said but by himself, the observation of which, with his discontent at whatever the inn afforded, and his angry impatience at the waiters, made Catherine grow every moment more in awe of him, and appeared to lengthen the 2 hours into 4. At last, however, the order of release was given, and much was Catherine then surprised by the General's proposal of her taking his place in his son's curricle for the rest of the journey. The day was fine, and he was anxious for her seeing as much of the country as possible. The remembrance of Mr. Allen's opinion respecting young men's open carriages made her blush at the mention of such a plan, and her first thought was to decline it. But her second was of greater deference for General Tilney's judgment. He could not propose anything improper for her, and in the course of a few minutes she found herself with Henry in the curricle, as happy a being as ever existed. A very short trial convinced her that a curricle was the prettiest equipage in the world. The chaise and 4 wheeled off with some grandeur, to be sure, but it was a heavy and troublesome business, and she could not easily forget its having stopped 2 hours at Petty France. Half the time would have been enough for the curricle, and so nimbly were the light horses disposed to move, that had not the General chosen to have his own carriage lead the way, they could have passed it with ease in half a minute. But the merit of the curricle did not all belong to the horses. Henry drove so well, so quietly, without making any disturbance, without parading to her or swearing at them, so different from the only gentleman coachman who it was in her power to compare him with. And then his hat sat so well, and the innumerable capes of his greatcoat looked so becomingly important. To be driven by him, next to being dancing with him, was certainly the greatest happiness in the world. In addition to every other delight, she had now that of listening to her own praise, of being thanked at least on his sister's account for her kindness in thus becoming her visitor, of hearing it ranked as real friendship and described as creating real gratitude. His sister, he said, was uncomfortably circumstanced. She had no female companion, and in the frequent absence of her father was sometimes without any companion at all. "But how can that be?" said Catherine. "Are you not with her?" "Northanger is not more than half my home. I have an establishment at my own house in Woodston, which is nearly 20 miles from my father's, and some of my time is necessarily spent there." "How sorry you must be for that." "I am always sorry to leave Eleanor." "Yes, but besides your affection for her, you must be so fond of the Abbey. After being used to such a home as the Abbey, an ordinary parsonage house must be very disagreeable." He smiled and said, "You have formed a very favourable idea of the Abbey." "To be sure I have. Is it not a fine old place, just like what one reads about? And are you prepared to encounter all the horrors that a building such as what one reads about may produce? Have you a stout heart, nerves fit for sliding panels and tapestry? Oh, yes, I do not think I should be easily frightened, because there will be so many people in the house. And besides, it's never been uninhabited and left deserted for years, and then the family come back to it unawares without giving any notice, as generally happens. No, certainly. We shall not have to explore our way into a hall dimly lighted by the expiring embers of a wood fire, nor be obliged to spread our beds on the floor of a room without windows, doors, or furniture. But you must be aware that when a young lady is, by whatever means, introduced into a dwelling of this kind, she is always lodged apart from the rest of the family. While they snugly repair to their own end of the house, she is formally conducted by Dorothy, the ancient housekeeper, up a different staircase and along many gloomy passages into an apartment never used since some cousin of kin died in it about 20 years before. Can you stand such a ceremony as this? Will not your mind misgive you, when you find yourself in this gloomy chamber, too lofty and extensive for you, with only the feeble rays of a single lamp to take in its size, its walls hung with tapestries exhibiting figures as large as life, and the bed of dark green stuff or purple velvet presenting every funeral appearance? Will not your heart sink within you? Oh, but this will not happen to me, I'm sure. How dreadfully will you examine the furniture of your apartment, and what will you discern? Not tables, toilettes, wardrobes, or drawers, but on one side perhaps the remains of a broken lute, and on the other a ponderous chest, which no efforts can open, and over the fireplace the portrait of some handsome warrior, whose features will so incomprehensibly strike you that you will not be able to withdraw your eyes from it. Dorothy, meanwhile, no less struck by your appearance, gazes on you in great agitation, and drops a few unintelligible hints. To raise your spirits, moreover, she gives you reason to suppose that the part of the Abbey where you inhabit is undoubtedly haunted, and informs you that you will not have a single domestic within call. With this parting cordial she curtsies off. You listen to the sound of her receding footsteps as long as the last echo can reach you, and when, with fainting spirits, you attempt to fasten your door, you discover with increasing alarm that it has no lock. Oh, Mr. Tilney, how frightful! This is just like a book. But it cannot really happen to me. I'm sure your housekeeper is not really Dorothy. Well, what then? Nothing farther to alarm perhaps may occur on the first night. After surmounting your unconquerable horror of the bed, you will retire to rest and get a few hours' unquiet slumber. But on the second, or at farthest the third night after your arrival, you will probably have a violent storm. Peals of thunder so loud as to seem to shake the edifice to its foundation will roll round the neighbouring mountains, and during the frightful gusts of wind which accompany it, you will probably think you discern, for your lamp is not extinguished, one part of the hanging more violently agitated than the rest. Unable, of course, to repress your curiosity in so favourable a moment for indulging it, you will instantly arise, and throwing your dressing-gown around you, proceed to examine this mystery. After a very short search, you will discover a division in the tapestry so artfully constructed as to defy the minutest inspection, and upon opening it, a door will immediately appear, which door being only secured by massy bars and a padlock, you will, after a few efforts, succeed in opening, and with your lamp in your hand will pass through it into a small vaulted room. No, indeed, I should be too much frightened to do any such thing. What? Not when Dorothy has given you to understand that there is a secret subterraneous communication between your apartment and the chapel of St. Anthony, scarcely 2 miles off? Could you shrink from so simple an adventure? No, no, you will proceed into this small vaulted room, and through thus into several others, without perceiving anything very remarkable in either. In one, perhaps, there may be a dagger, in another a few drops of blood, and in a third the remains of some instrument of torture. But there being nothing in all this out of the common way, your lamp being nearly extinguished, you will return towards your own apartment. In repassing through the small vaulted room, however, your eyes will be attracted towards a large old-fashioned cabinet of ebony and gold, which, though narrowly examining the furniture before, you had passed unnoticed. Impelled by an irresistible presentiment, you will eagerly advance to it, unlock its folding doors, and search into every drawer, but for some time without discovering anything of importance, perhaps nothing but a considerable hoard of diamonds. At last, however, by touching a secret spring, an inner compartment will open. A roll of paper appears. You seize it. It contains many sheets of manuscript. You hasten with the precious treasures into your own chamber, but scarcely have you been able to decipher, O thou whomsoever thou may be, in whose hands these memoirs of the wretched Matilda may fall, when your lamp suddenly expires in the socket and leaves you in total darkness. "Oh, no, do not say so." "Well, go on." But Henry was too much amused by the interest he'd raised to be able to carry it farther. He could no longer command solemnity either of subject or voice, and was obliged to entreat her to use her own fancy in the perusal of Matilda's woes. Catherine, recollecting herself, grew ashamed of her eagerness, and began earnestly to assure him that her attention had been fixed without the smallest apprehension of really meeting with what he related. Miss Tilney, she was sure, would never put her into such a chamber as he had described. She was not at all afraid. As they drew near the end of their journey, her impatience for a sight of the Abbey, for some time suspended by his conversation on all subjects very different, returned in full force, and every bend in the road was expected, with solemn awe, to afford a glimpse of its massy walls of grey stone, rising amidst a grove of ancient oaks, with the last beams of the sun playing in beautiful splendour on its high Gothic windows. But so low did the building stand that she found herself passing through the great gates of the lodge into the very grounds of Northanger without having discerned even an antique chimney. She knew not that she had any right to be surprised, but there was something in this mode of approach which she certainly had not expected. To pass between lodges of a modern appearance, to find herself with such ease in the very precincts of the Abbey, and driven so rapidly along a smooth level road of fine gravel, without obstacle, alarm, or solemnity of any kind, struck her as odd and inconsistent. She was not long at leisure, however, for such considerations. A sudden scud of rain, driving full in her face, made it impossible for her to observe anything further, and fixed all her thoughts on the welfare of her new straw bonnet. And she was actually under the Abbey walls, was springing, with Henry's assistance, from the carriage, was beneath the shelter of the old porch, and had even passed on to the hall, where her friend and the General were waiting to welcome her, without feeling one awful foreboding of future misery to herself, or the one moment's suspicion of any past scenes of horror being acted within the solemn edifice. The breeze had not seemed to waft the sights of the murderer to her. It had wafted nothing worse than a thick mizzling rain, and having given a good shake to her habit, she was ready to be shown into the common drawing-room, and capable of considering where she was. An abbey. Yes, it was delightful to be really in an abbey. But she doubted, as she looked round the room, whether anything within her observation would have given her the consciousness. The furniture was in all the profusion and elegance of modern taste. The fireplace, where she had expected the ample and ponderous carving of former times, was contracted to a Rumford, with slabs of plain though handsome marble, and ornaments over it of the prettiest English china. The windows, to which she looked with particular dependence, from having heard the General talk of his preserving them in their Gothic form with reverential care, were yet less what her fancy had portrayed. To be sure, the pointed arch was preserved, the form of them was Gothic, they might even be casements, but every pane was so large and clear, so light. To an imagination which had hoped for the smallest divisions and the heaviest stonework, for painted glass, dirt, and cobwebs, the difference was very distressing. The General, perceiving how her eye was employed, began to talk of the smallness of the room and simplicity of the furniture, where everything being for daily use, pretended only to comfort, etc., flattering himself, however, that there were some apartments in the Abbey not unworthy her notice, and was proceeding to mention the costly gilding of one in particular, when, taking out his watch, he stopped short to pronounce it with surprise within 20 minutes of 5. This seemed the word of separation, and Catherine found herself hurried away by Miss Tilney in such a manner as convinced her that the strictest punctuality to the family hours would be expected at Northanger. Returning through the large and lofty hall, they ascended a broad staircase of shining oak, which, after many flights and many landing places, brought them upon a long, wide gallery. On one side it had a range of doors, and it was lighted on the other by windows which Catherine had only time to discover looked into a quadrangle, before Miss Tilney led the way into a chamber, and scarcely staying to hope she would find it comfortable, left her with an anxious entreaty that she would make as little alteration as possible in her dress. Chapter 21. A moment's glance was enough to satisfy Catherine that her apartment was very unlike the one which Henry had endeavoured to alarm her by the description of. It was by no means unreasonably large, and contained neither tapestry nor velvet. The walls were papered, the floor was carpeted, and the windows were neither less perfect nor more dim than those of the drawing-room below. The furniture, though not of the latest fashion, was handsome and comfortable, and the air of the room altogether far from uncheerful. Her heart instantaneously at ease on this point, she resolved to lose no time in particular examination of anything, as she greatly dreaded disobliging the General by any delay. Her habit, therefore, was thrown off with all possible haste, and she was preparing to unpin the linen package which the chaise seat had conveyed for her immediate accommodation, when her eye suddenly fell on a large high chest, standing back in a deep recess on one side of the fireplace. The sight of it made her start, and forgetting everything else, she stood gazing on it in motionless wonder, while these thoughts crossed her. This is strange indeed. I did not expect such a sight as this. An immense heavy chest. What can it hold? Why should it be placed here? Pushed back, too, as if meant to be out of sight. I will look into it. Cost me what it may, I will look into it, and directly, too, by daylight. If I stay till the evening, my candle may go out. She advanced and examined it closely. It was cedar, curiously inlaid with some darker wood, and raised about a foot from the ground on a carved stand of the same. The lock was silver, though tarnished from age, and at each end were the imperfect remains of handles, also silver, broken perhaps prematurely by some strange violence, and on the centre of the lid was a mysterious cipher in the same metal. Catherine bent over it intently, but without being able to distinguish anything with certainty. She could not, in whatever direction she took it, believe the last letter to be a T, and yet that it should be anything else in that house was a circumstance to raise no common degree of astonishment. If not originally theirs, by what strange events could it have fallen into the Tilney family? Her fearful curiosity was every moment growing greater, and seizing with trembling hands the clasp of the lock, she resolved at all hazards to satisfy herself at least as to its contents. With difficulty, for something seemed to resist her efforts, she raised the lid a few inches. But at that moment a sudden knocking at the door of the room made her, starting, quit her hold, and the lid closed with alarming violence. This ill-timed intruder was Miss Tilney's maid, sent by her mistress to be of use to Miss Morland, and though Catherine immediately dismissed her, it recalled her to the sense of what she ought to be doing, and forced her, in spite of her anxious desire to penetrate this mystery, to proceed in her dressing without further delay. Her progress was not quick, for her thoughts and her eyes were still bent on the object so well calculated to interest and alarm, and though she dared not waste a moment upon a second attempt, she could not remain many paces from the chest. At length, however, having slipped one arm into her gown, her toilet seemed so nearly finished that the impatience of her curiosity might safely be indulged. One moment surely might be spared, and so desperate should be the exertion of her strength, that unless secured by supernatural means, the lid in one moment should be thrown back. With this spirit she sprang forward, and her confidence did not deceive her. Her resolute effort threw back the lid, and gave to her astonished eyes the view of a white cotton counterpane properly folded, reposing at one end of the chest, in undisputed possession. She was gazing on it with the first blush of surprise when Miss Tilney, anxious for her friend's being ready, entered the room, and, to the rising shame of having harboured for some minutes an absurd expectation, was then added to the shame of being caught in so idle a search. "That is a curious old chest, is it not?" said Miss Tilney, as Catherine hastily closed it and turned away to the glass. "It is impossible to say how many generations it's been here. How it came to be first put in this room I know not, but I've not had it moved because I thought it might sometimes be of use in holding hats and bonnets." The worst of it is that its weight makes it difficult to open. In that corner, however, it's at least out of the way." Catherine had no leisure for speech, being at once blushing, trying her gown, and forming wide resolutions with the most violent dispatch. Miss Tilney gently hinted her fear of being late, and in half a minute they ran downstairs together, in an alarm not wholly unfounded, for General Tilney was pacing in the drawing-room, his watch in his hand, and having, on the very instant of their entering, pulled the bell with violence, ordered dinner to be on the table directly. Catherine trembled at the emphasis which he spoke, and sat pale and breathless, in a most humble mood, concerned for his children and detesting old chests. And the General, recovering his politeness as he looked at her, spent the rest of his time in scolding his daughter for so foolishly hurrying her fair friend, who was absolutely out of breath from haste, when there was not the least occasion for hurry in the world. But Catherine could not at all get over the double distress of having involved her friend in a lecture and been a great simpleton herself, till they were happily seated at the dinner-table, where the General's complacent smiles and a good appetite of her own restored her to peace. The dining-parlour was a noble room, suitable in its dimensions to a much larger drawing-room than the one in common use, and fitted up in a style of luxury and expense which was almost lost on the unpractised eye of Catherine, who saw little more than its spaciousness and the number of their attendants. On the former she spoke her loud admiration, and the General, with a very gracious countenance, acknowledged that it was by no means an ill-sized room, and further confessed that, though as careless on such subjects as most people, he did look upon a tolerably large eating-room as one of the necessities of life. He supposed, however, that she must have been used to better-sized apartments at Mr. Allen's. "No, indeed," was Catherine's honest assurance. "Mr. Allen's dining-parlour was not more than half as large, and she had never seen so large a room as this in her life." The General's good humour increased. Why, as he had such rooms, he thought it would be simple not to make use of them. But upon his honour he believed there might be more comfort in rooms of only half their size. Mr. Allen's house, he was sure, must be exactly of the true size for rational happiness. The evening passed without any further disturbance, and in the occasional absence of General Tilney, with much positive cheerfulness. It was only in his presence that Catherine felt the smallest fatigue from her journey, and even then, even in moments of languor or restraint, a sense of general happiness preponderated, and she could think of her friends in Bath without one wish of being with them. The night was stormy. The wind had been rising at intervals the whole afternoon, and by the time the party broke up, it blew and rained violently. Catherine, as she crossed the hall, listened to the tempest with sensations of awe. When she heard it rage round the corner of the ancient building and close with a sudden fury at a distant door, felt for the first time that she was really in an abbey. Yes, these were the characteristic sounds. They brought to her recollection a countless variety of dreadful situations and horrid scenes which such buildings had witnessed and such storms ushered in, and most heartily did she rejoice in happier circumstances attending her entrance within the walls so solemn. She had nothing to dread from midnight assassins or drunken gallants. Henry had certainly been only in jest in what he had told her that morning. In a house so furnished and so guarded, she could have nothing to explore or to suffer, and might go to her bedroom as securely as if it had been her own chamber at Fullerton. Thus wisely fortifying her mind as she proceeded upstairs, she was enabled, especially on perceiving that Miss Tilney slept only 2 doors from her, to enter her room with a tolerably stout heart, and her spirits were immediately assisted by the cheerful blaze of a wood fire. "How much better is this," she said, as she walked to the fender, "how much better to find a fire ready lit than to have to wait shivering in the cold till all the family are in bed, as so many poor girls have been obliged to do, and then to have a faithful old servant frightening one by coming in with a faggot. How glad I am that Northanger is what it is. If it had been like some other places, I do not know that in such a night as this I could have answered for my courage. But now, to be sure, there's nothing to alarm one." She looked round the room. The window curtains seemed in motion. It could be nothing but the violence of the wind penetrating through the divisions of the shutters. She stepped boldly forward, carelessly humming a tune to assure herself of its being so, peeped courageously behind each curtain, saw nothing on either low window-seat to scare her, and, on placing a hand against the shutter, felt the strongest conviction of the wind's force. A glance at the old chest, as she turned away from this examination, was not without its use. She scorned the causeless fears of an idle fancy, and began with the most happy indifference to prepare herself for bed. She should take her time. She should not hurry herself. She did not care if she were the last person up in that house, but she would not make up her fire. That would seem cowardly, as if she wished for the protection of light after she were in bed. The fire therefore died away, and Catherine, having spent the best part of an hour in her arrangements, was beginning to think of stepping into bed, when, on giving a parting glance round the room, she was struck by the appearance of a high, old-fashioned black cabinet, which, though in a situation conspicuous enough, had never caused her to notice before. Henry's words, the description of the ebony cabinet which was to escape her observation at first, immediately rushed across her, and though there could be nothing really in it, there was something whimsical. It was certainly a very remarkable coincidence. She took her candle and looked closely at the cabinet. It was not absolutely ebony and gold, but it was Japan, black and yellow Japan of the handsomest kind, and as she held her candle, the yellow had very much the effect of gold. The key was in the door, and she had a strange fancy to look into it. Not, however, with the smallest expectation of finding anything, but it was so very odd after what Henry had said. In short, she could not sleep till she had examined it. So, placing the candle with great caution on a chair, she seized the key, and with a very tremulous hand tried to turn it. But it resisted her utmost strength. Alarmed, but not discouraged, she tried another way. A bolt flew, and she believed herself successful. But how strangely mysterious! The door was still immovable. She paused a moment in a breathless wonder. The wind roared down the chimney, the rain beat in torrents against the windows, and everything seemed to speak of the awfulness of her situation. To retire to bed, however, unsatisfied on such a point, would be in vain, since sleep must be impossible with the consciousness of a cabinet so mysteriously closed in her immediate vicinity. Again, therefore, she applied herself to the key, and after moving it in every possible way, for some instants with the determined celerity of hope's last effort, the door suddenly yielded to her hand. Her heart leaped with exultation at such a victory, and having thrown open each folding door, the second being secured only by bolts of less wonderful construction than the lock, though in that her eye could discern anything unusual, a double range of small drawers appeared in view, with some larger drawers above and below them, and in the centre a small door, closed also with a lock and key, secured in all probability a cavity of importance. Catherine's heart beat quick, but her courage did not fail her. With a cheek flushed by hope and an eye straining with curiosity, her fingers grasped at the handle of a drawer and drew it forth. It was entirely empty. With less alarm and greater eagerness she seized the second, a third, a fourth. Each was equally empty. Not one was left unsearched, and in not one was anything found. Well read in the art of concealing a treasure, the possibility of false linings to the drawers did not escape her, and she felt round each with anxious acuteness in vain. The place in the middle alone remained now unexplored, and though she had never from the first had the smallest idea of finding anything in any part of the cabinet, and was not in the least disappointed at her ill success thus far, it would be foolish not to examine it thoroughly while she was about it. It was some time, however, before she could unfasten the door, the same difficulty occurring in the management of this inner lock as of the outer, but at length it did open, and not in vain, as hitherto was her search. Her quick eyes directly fell on a roll of paper pushed back into the further part of the cavity, apparently for concealment, and her feelings at that moment were indescribable. Her heart fluttered, her knees trembled, her cheeks grew pale. She seized with an unsteady hand the precious manuscript. For half a glance sufficed to ascertain the written characters, and while she acknowledged with awful sensation this striking exemplification of what Henry had foretold, resolved instantly to peruse every line before she attempted to rest. The dimness of the light her candle emitted made her turn to it with alarm, but there was no danger of its sudden extinction. It had yet some hours to burn, and that she might not have any greater difficulty in distinguishing the writing than what its ancient date might occasion, she hastily snuffed it. Alas, it was snuffed and extinguished in one. A lamp could not have expired with more awful effect. Catherine, for a few moments, was motionless with horror. It was done completely. Not a remnant of light in the wick could give hope of a rekindling breath. Darkness, impenetrable and immovable, filled the room. A violent gust of wind, rising with sudden fury, added fresh horror to the moment. Catherine trembled from head to foot. In the pause which succeeded, a sound like receding footsteps and the closing of a distant door struck on her affrighted ear. Human nature could support no more. A cold sweat stood on her forehead. The manuscript fell from her hand, and groping her way to the bed, she jumped hastily in, and sought some suspensions of agony by creeping far underneath the clothes. To close her eyes in sleep that night, she felt, must be entirely out of the question. With a curiosity so justly awakened, and feelings in every way so agitated, repose must be absolutely impossible. The storm, too, abroad so dreadful. She had not been used to feel alarm from wind, but now every blast seemed fraught with awful intelligence. The manuscript, so wonderfully found, so wonderfully accomplishing the morning's prediction, how was that to be accounted for? What could it contain? To whom could it relate? By what means could it have been so long concealed? And how singularly strange that it should then fall to her lot to discover it. Till she had made herself mistress of its contents, however, she could have neither repose nor comfort. But with the sun's first rays she was determined to peruse it. But many were the tedious hours which must yet intervene. She shuddered, tossed about in her bed, and envied every quiet sleeper. The storm still raged, and various were the noises, more terrific even than the wind, which struck at intervals on her startled ear. The very curtains of her bed seemed at one moment in motion, and at another the lock of her door was agitated, as if by the attempt of someone to enter. Hollow murmurs seemed to creep along the gallery, and more than once her blood was chilled by the sound of distant moans. Hour after hour passed away, and the wearied Catherine had heard 3 proclaimed by all the clocks in the house before the tempest subsided, or she unknowingly fell fast asleep.
All right. So, oh, Catherine, that was the best end. And it was going to be really intense, and everything's good. And oh my God. And then she fell asleep. The end. You're welcome. Thank you, Jane Austen. So, first off, Henry Tilney got his imagination on. Boy proved his Udolpho chops. I didn't bother going into the 7,000 footnotes and annotations that I have access to, where every single thing that Henry Tilney said sub-referenced one of our Gothic novels of the day. Usually Mysteries of Udolpho, but not only. It was clear that Jane Austen read very widely in that genre. So that's fun. And if you've read any of those books, first, God bless you. Second, you picked up on a lot of inside jokes. And I guarantee you, I promise you, any specific, whether it was a chest or velvet or green stuff or whatever, that was drawn very specifically from a Gothic novel of the time. So Henry Tilney, yay. And General Tilney, interesting. That was one of the few times where I thought, yeah, if these were real people, I actually don't know that General Tilney would have put her up front with his son, who he knows she's been dancing with. I don't know. That seems a little, Of course, he's a tall man, so he probably could see out of the chaise to still be observed. That's probably true. He'd probably be able to make sure that they weren't up to any monkey business. Not that if I knew Catherine, I wouldn't expect her to be up to any monkey business either, because she's Catherine. So it's probably fine. Either way, it was very lovely of him to put her up out of kind of the bucket seat, the carriage hole that she was riding in, put her up where she could see the countryside as she approaches Northanger Abbey. And of course, the general does want to show off a bit, just a bit to her as well. We did learn some important things about Henry. His home is not Northanger Abbey. He has his own place in Woodston, which is not far away. And he must have a curate. He must have hired somebody to help him out with his position as the vicar in that particular town. This is exactly what Papa Bronte did eventually. He finally had enough money that he could hire a curate, and the curate, eventually one of the curates, is the gentleman who Charlotte Bronte married and who she was going to raise a family with before she died while she was pregnant. Sorry to bring it down there. Either way, curate, happy. That's a happy thing. It means Henry has a little bit more time on his hands. If it makes you think that he must therefore be a frivolous person, if you've read the Wild Nights on the Moors Story of the Brontes book, it's pretty clear that the amount of work that a clergyman had to do at this time went way beyond writing a sermon for Sunday. Depending on how large the area was, there was more than enough to keep you busy. Between weddings, births, and deaths, you were hopping pretty constantly. Not to mention that you're kind of the spiritual leader of the community, and there's just ministering to people that you're expected to do, as well as keep the place up, plan for the holidays, plan for your Sunday sermons, remembering that Sunday is not just a 1-hour sermon with a service that is rote. It is all day Sunday. So having a curate is not just, I want to go be an idle rich boy and have somebody else do my job for me. Henry's being responsible. Another thing that I didn't bother to point out before, but when they're driving up to Northanger Abbey for the first time, the narrator points out that they are driving on a gravel drive. This was actually kind of new at this point, at the turn of the 18th century. Not so much the gravel drives before that. So that was yet another way that this was not quite the Gothic Abbey that Catherine was probably hoping for, but far more comfortable, far more modern, far more up to date. Not so much the shoddy Gothic wonder that Catherine may have been dreaming of. Now, I promised you some fun about Rumfords. All right, so Sir Benjamin Thompson, Count Rumford, by August 1796, Coleridge, the Xanadu, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Coleridge, had turned the name Rumford, as in a Rumford fireplace, he had turned it into a verb. And this is a quote. "The landlord has promised me to Rumfordize the chimneys," he wrote to a friend. And then in a letter to the editor of the Morning Chronicle on C. Cole, SEA-COAL, and sensibility, C. Cole and sensibility, haha. This is September 1801. He tendered a metaphoric upgrade. "We should Rumfordize our feelings in such a manner as to be able to vie with our wooden-fueled neighbors in sensibility." It allowed a Rumford fireplace would allow you to burn coal as well as firewood. The concentrated space made coal a little bit more functional, just like putting coal in a grate or into something like a Franklin stove. However, there's even more than just that. There is an etching of the day by James Gilray, Gillray, and the etching is called "The Comforts of a Rumford Stove." It's an etching with watercolor. It was published in 1800, and it is, as it's put here, it features Rumford himself toasting his buns by standing in front of this marble-faced fireplace, very small fireplace. The satirist Peter Pindar soon after hailed this genius of home heating in a 27-page tribute in neoclassical couplets, and I will read you a few. "Muse, at the sound of Rumford, raise thy voice, and bid our kitchen furniture rejoice. Lo, every parlor, drawing room I see boasts of thy stoves and talks of naught but thee." And there were reviews of the reviews of these, both etching and these 27 pages of rhyming couplets, all about a fireplace. You're welcome. On that note, I leave you. Have a great week. Be well, be safe, get a vaccination, wear a mask, take care of each other. I'll talk to you soon. Be well. Bye. If you like what you hear on Craftlit, please review us on iTunes, like us on Facebook, join in the fun in our Facebook group, which is Craftlit Annotated Audiobooks. Always the nicest group of people you're going to find on Facebook, and the place where you can come to and say, nobody else was going to understand this, but I knew you all would. And of course, thank you for your support of Craftlit. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.